Hey everyone, it's Mr. Drake. We have talked in this unit already about the independence movement in India, and we're going to continue looking at 20th century nationalistic movement by looking at Africa. By the end of this video, you should be able to explain why African countries in large numbers became independent after World War II, whereas before World War II they had been primarily controlled by European powers. Also be able to identify the important people and events surrounding independence movement in Ghana and Kenya. Obviously, there are independence movements in many countries. There's just a couple of examples we're going to look at here. If we looked at every country's independence movement, it would be like a 3-hour video. Also, be able to describe apartheid in South Africa and identify some of the issues that are causing problems in Africa to this day. Also, be able to define or identify those people in terms Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, Afrikaners, the African National Congress, and Nelson Mandela. So first we're going to talk a little bit about the decolonization of Africa. Before World War II, there were only 3 completely independent nations in Africa that are noted on this map in purple. One is Egypt in the upper right, which was given independence in 1920. Ethiopia, kind of in the middle, East Africa there, has been independent back to prehistoric times. And then Liberia, which is a little country over on the west coast of Africa, which was founded by freed American slaves in the early 1800s. South Africa had mostly independent rule by the 1930s or so, although they didn't become a full republic until the 60s. Anyway, by 1980, as you can see on this map, most of Africa had become independent from foreign control. Now, why did that happen between about 1945 and 1980? One reason was colonies' contributions during World War II. They gave a lot to the European countries in terms of resources and manpower, similar to World War I, really. But after World War II, it ended up breeding a nationalistic movement in those countries. People who had gone off and fought came back and wanted to apply the values they had fought for overseas, say in Europe, fighting the Nazis. They thought that they should be fighting for similar freedoms from oppression at home. Also, Europe was unwilling to spend the money and the resources to try to maintain control in those countries. A little wary of war after 2 world wars in the last quarter century. Also, plenty of Western educated people from these African countries who started up nationalism movements in their homeland, similar to what Gandhi did in India, having been educated primarily in England. So independence movements usually went one of 2 ways. Some were peaceful. An example of a relatively peaceful independence movement was the Gold Coast, or Ghana. Kwame Nkrumah was sort of the father of Ghanaian independence. There he is pictured with President John F. Kennedy in the 1960s. He had been inspired by American civil rights leaders. He was inspired by Gandhi and began to lead boycotts of British goods in his country to try to weaken British power. He was thrown in prison for a time. There were riots, there were outbreaks of violence, but it was largely a non-violent civil disobedience type movement. And the Gold Coast won its independence in 1957. When they did, Nkrumah and the ruling party changed the name of the country from Gold Coast to Ghana, which is somewhat symbolic because Gold Coast is what it was called by the British because it was so rich in natural resources and they got gold from there, right? And Ghana is the name of an ancient African kingdom or empire. So you see this transition from European influence to having more pride in their African ancestry and African heritage. While some were peaceful, some independence movements were somewhat violent. An example of that would be Kenya. The movement was primarily led by Jomo Kenyatta, who you see pictured there. He was a supporter of nonviolence, but there were a lot of people in Kenya who mounted an armed resistance to European rule. Those people were called the Mau Mau. Most famously, the Mau Mau Uprising led to the deaths of up to 15,000 native Kenyans who died fighting to push the British out of their country. And this event shocked a lot of people, both in Britain and throughout the world. And eventually, Kenya is granted independence, and Jomo Kenyatta becomes the leader of a free and independent Kenya. So again, just keep in mind that all of these countries in Africa that became independent generally went about it one of 2 ways. It was peaceful and nonviolent, but in some cases there were armed rebellions. Another example besides Kenya would be Algeria of that. So, independence does bring some downsides along with it. As we talked about when we did imperialism in Africa, there was a division of territory in Africa that didn't care much about the people who actually lived there. So, after these countries became independent, in many cases there was civil war between rival peoples or rival tribes who lived within those borders to determine who was going to actually be in charge. Nigeria is a prime example. One of Africa's most populous countries had a huge civil war throughout the 1960s as a result of independence. There's a picture of fighting there during the Nigerian Civil War. In some cases, governments were put in charge who were incompetent and weak and had no idea what they were doing, and they were overthrown by the military in some cases, which led to dictatorships or one-party rule. An example of that would be Uganda, which was ruled by a military dictator named Idi Amin throughout the 1970s. Now, no discussion of post-World War II Africa would be complete without a quick look at apartheid in South Africa. Apartheid is the legal separation of races. It was a white-dominated society. People known as Afrikaners, which were white South Africans who had Dutch ancestry. They gained power after World War II in response to black Africans moving into cities and trying to get more power for themselves, which they didn't like. And they ended up seizing power in the country from 1948 all the way to 1994. And under apartheid, blacks were forced into menial labor. They had to live in special designated areas that were not very nice. They had to carry passes with them, so they essentially were prisoners in their own country. The main group that opposed apartheid was the African National Congress, or the ANC, which had been founded way back in 1912, because even before apartheid, whites oppressed blacks in South Africa. The most well-known and vocal leader of the ANC is Nelson Mandela, who was eventually thrown in prison by South Africa's government, and he stayed there almost completely in solitary confinement from 1963 all the way until 1990. Even with Mandela in prison throughout the 60s and 70s and 80s, opposition to apartheid continued mostly in a non-violent fashion, primarily, most notably led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, whose picture you see there. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in the 1980s for his efforts to end apartheid. Now, as the era of apartheid wore on, even whites began to oppose it, partially because they began to realize that it was oppressive and unfair. Apartheid also made South Africa look really, really bad in other parts of the world, and they had, embargoes put on them where countries would refuse to trade with them, so they weren't making any money. In terms of sports is a big deal in South Africa. They were banned from FIFA, which is soccer's governing body, for many, many years. So everyone eventually pretty much came to oppose apartheid, and it ended in the 1990s. And in 1994, South Africa held elections where everybody could vote regardless of race, and Nelson Mandela, who had been freed from prison 4 years earlier, was elected president, and he remained the president of South Africa until 1999. And there's a picture of him with President Bill Clinton while he was leading South Africa. As of the making of this video in 2013, Nelson Mandela is still alive and living in South Africa. So, what problems exist in Africa today? Africa is a fairly embattled continent, largely as a result of the struggles that we've sort of talked about already in this video. One problem is famine. Sometimes the famine, the lack of food, is caused by natural factors such as droughts or, the death of livestock because of extreme heat or lack of water. And then sometimes it's made even worse by civil war, where countries or armies will confiscate food almost as a method of warfare. But famine has been a major problem in Africa, especially in the 1970s and 80s, but in some parts of Africa even today. Desertification, that is the transition of some lands from being fertile into being desert. Some of that is caused by the cutting down of trees to sell the lumber as an export, to try to make money for the country, which is all well and good, but if you take all the vegetation away, the soil loses its nutrients and eventually it turns to dust and you have a desert. So that's been a problem because it's harder to grow food in those areas, which just makes the famine even worse. Disease is a big problem as well, caused by lack of sanitation, lack of protection as far as sexual activity goes. As you can see on this map on the lower right-hand corner of the screen, HIV and AIDS are a major, major problem in Africa to this day. As you can see, the darker the color there, the more cases of AIDS that exist. So sub-Saharan Africa, Southern Africa, especially afflicted. And as you may know, there's no cure for AIDS or HIV, but there are medicines that exist to help treat the symptoms, and those just don't exist in Africa because they're so expensive, really. So, Africa, a very embattled continent, but a very interesting history over the last 70 years or so. Be sure to watch this video in preparation for your final test on 20th century nationalism movements, and as always, ask your teacher if you have any questions. Cheers.